21 Lessons for the 21st Century. This video is based on key insights from the book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. Chapter 1, Disillusionment. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that people understand the world through stories. Throughout the 20th century, three big stories tried to explain everything: fascism, communism, and liberalism. After the fall of communism, liberalism seemed to win, promising freedom and progress for everyone. It believed that if countries just became more open and free, everything would get better. Leaders like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both believed in this idea. However, Harari points out that this liberal story is now losing its power. Since the 2008 financial crisis, people have started to doubt it. Walls are going up again, and countries are becoming less willing to work together. Leaders in countries like Turkey and Russia are trying out ways to rule that aren't fully democratic. Even China isn't worried about being on the wrong side of history anymore. The events of 2016, like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, showed that even strong liberal countries were starting to question the old ways. People are either longing for the past or feeling like the system is rigged against them. Harari argues that we've gone from having three global stories to two, to one, and now to none. This is scary because without a story, nothing makes sense. He compares it to how people in the Soviet Union felt when communism collapsed, lost and confused. Liberals today are shocked that things aren't going as planned and are reacting with fear, imagining the worst possible outcomes. A big part of this confusion comes from how quickly technology is changing. The political systems we have were built for a world of factories and televisions, not for the internet and artificial intelligence. Politicians and voters struggle to understand these new technologies, let alone control them. Harari notes that we didn't even vote on the internet. Our systems are falling behind, and it's hard to know how to deal with things like AI and blockchain. He explains that technology is making things incredibly complex, even in areas like finance, where few people truly understand what's happening. As AI gets smarter, it might become impossible for anyone to fully grasp the financial system. This could mean governments have to rely on algorithms to make decisions about money, which is a little unsettling. New technologies like blockchain could also change how we pay taxes, potentially making traditional methods obsolete. But the biggest change isn't just about money. It's about controlling our own bodies and minds. Harari suggests that we're moving towards a time where we can engineer our brains, extend our lives, and even control our thoughts. While this sounds like science fiction, it's becoming more and more possible. The problem is, we don't know what the consequences will be. Just like we messed up the environment by not understanding how ecosystems work, we could mess up our own minds by not understanding how they work. Harari emphasizes that these technological changes are being driven by engineers and scientists, not by politicians or the public. He questions whether our political systems can keep up. He points out that during the 2016 U.S. election, the focus was on Hillary Clinton's emails, not on the impact of automation on jobs. People are starting to feel irrelevant, like the future isn't about them. In the past, people felt important because they were vital to the economy. Now, they worry that machines will replace them. This feeling of irrelevance might be why people are turning away from the liberal story. Harari then looks back at history, noting that liberalism has faced crises before. It survived challenges from imperialism, fascism, and communism by adapting and incorporating good ideas from those movements. It expanded its idea of who deserves freedom and rights, eventually including more people. However, this time is different. The current challenge isn't a clear opposing ideology like communism. It's more of a sense of emptiness and a longing for the past. Many people are turning to nationalism and religion, dreaming of a return to a golden age. Harari uses examples like Donald Trump's "Make America Great Again" slogan and the desire to rebuild ancient temples in Israel. He argues that these nostalgic dreams don't offer a solution for the world as a whole. Liberalism might survive, but it needs to adapt to address new challenges like ecological collapse and technological disruption. Harari concludes that we need to stop panicking and start being honest about how little we understand. He suggests that the first step is to admit we're bewildered. He then proposes that we need to figure out how to deal with the challenges posed by technology, especially the potential for mass unemployment. The key to finding a new story for the world will be understanding how to navigate these technological changes and create a future where everyone has a place. Chapter 2, Work. Yuval Noah Harari explores a future where traditional jobs may disappear, replaced by increasingly capable machines. He cautions that simply assuming new jobs will magically appear, as they have in the past, is risky. The changes coming with artificial intelligence are different. Previously, machines took over physical tasks, leaving humans to focus on thinking, feeling, and understanding people. Now, AI is starting to excel at those very human skills too. Harari explains that AI isn't just about faster computers. It's also about breakthroughs in understanding how our brains and emotions work. Scientists are learning how our choices are made, revealing that much of what we think of as intuition is actually just our brains quickly recognizing patterns. This means AI can potentially outperform humans in jobs requiring judgment, like driving, banking, or even law, because it can analyze information and predict behavior with incredible accuracy. It's not about computers having a soul, but about them being very good at spotting patterns. A key point Harari makes is that AI has advantages humans don't. It can be easily connected and constantly updated. Imagine a network of self-driving cars all communicating with each other, instantly adjusting to changing traffic conditions. Or doctors around the world receiving the latest medical information at the same moment. This interconnectedness and constant learning give AI a powerful edge. He uses the example of chess, where AI has moved beyond simply calculating moves to demonstrating creative strategies that surprise even human experts. However, Harari doesn't believe job creation alone will solve the problem. New jobs may require skills many people don't have and can't easily learn. He worries about a useless class of people left behind as automation advances. He points out that past industrial revolutions created new opportunities for those with basic skills, but the future may demand expertise that's hard to attain. Harari suggests that we need to rethink our economic and social systems. Traditional ideas like communism, focused on the working class, may not be relevant in a world where work itself is less central. He proposes ideas like universal basic income, giving everyone a regular payment to cover basic needs, or universal basic services, like free healthcare and education. He emphasizes that simply providing for basic needs isn't enough. People also need purpose and community. Harari uses the example of ultra-Orthodox Jewish men in Israel who dedicate their lives to religious study, finding meaning and satisfaction even without traditional employment. He suggests that finding ways to provide purpose and connection will be crucial in a future where work is less central to our lives. Ultimately, Harari argues that we must prioritize protecting humans, not just jobs. He warns that relying on old solutions won't work. The challenges posed by AI and biotechnology are bigger than anything humanity has faced before and require bold new thinking. He cautions against simply slowing down progress, but instead focuses on preparing for a future where the very nature of work and society may be transformed. He believes that a future with AI doesn't have to be scary, but it requires careful planning and a willingness to embrace new ideas. Chapter 3, Liberty. Yuval Noah Harari explores how our ideas about freedom and power are changing in the 21st century. He begins by explaining that liberalism, which values individual choice, has been a powerful force in shaping modern society. Traditionally, liberalism believed people knew best voters in politics, customers in the economy, and individuals in their personal lives. However, Harari argues that this belief in free will might be challenged by new technologies. He points out that even though people disagree on many things, most agree on basic freedoms like voting and human rights. Harari notes that authority has shifted over time, from gods to humans. Now it might shift again, from humans to algorithms. He explains that feelings aren't magical, but are actually quick calculations our brains make to help us survive. For example, fear arises when our brain quickly calculates danger, like seeing a snake. Historically, we relied on feelings to make decisions because no outside system could understand us better. But with advancements in biology and computer science, that's changing. Big data algorithms can now monitor and understand our feelings better than we can ourselves. The author illustrates this with the example of healthcare. Soon, sensors will constantly monitor our health, detecting problems before we even feel sick. While this could lead to better health, it also means we might always be dealing with some medical condition and following algorithmic advice. Harari extends this idea to other areas of life, suggesting algorithms could choose movies for us, recommend jobs, and even suggest partners. He uses the example of a self-driving car deciding whether to save its passenger or pedestrians, highlighting the ethical dilemmas that arise when machines make life-or-death decisions. Harari emphasizes that algorithms don't need to be conscious to be powerful. They don't need to feel to understand our feelings and predict our behavior. He warns that this could lead to digital dictatorships, where governments control citizens not through force, but through manipulating their emotions and desires. He contrasts this with past forms of control, explaining that modern technology allows for a level of surveillance and manipulation previously unimaginable. He uses the example of North Korea, where biometric bracelets could monitor citizens' thoughts and feelings. The author points out that while AI is becoming more powerful, human consciousness is not receiving the same attention. Harari suggests we are becoming like data cows, efficiently producing data for a larger system, but losing our potential for deeper understanding and fulfillment. He argues that we need to invest in developing human consciousness alongside artificial intelligence to avoid a future where sophisticated machines empower human stupidity. He concludes that the biggest danger isn't a robot rebellion, but the misuse of AI by humans, potentially leading to a world of inequality and manipulation. Chapter 4: Equality. Yuval Noah Harari explores a troubling idea. The future might not be about everyone becoming more equal, but about growing differences between people. He points out that while the past century saw efforts to reduce inequality, things are changing. Today, a tiny group, the richest 1%, controls a huge amount of the world's wealth, and the gap is getting bigger. He warns that this isn't just about money. It could lead to real divisions in society, even changes in what it means to be human. Harari explains that throughout history, inequality has always existed. It started when people began owning things like land and tools. But in the past, differences were mostly about what people had. Now, with new technologies like artificial intelligence, AI, and bioengineering, differences could become about what people are. Imagine a future where the wealthy can afford treatments to make themselves smarter, stronger, and live longer, while others can't. This could create a split between a superhuman class and everyone else. The author emphasizes that data is becoming the most important thing in the world, even more important than land or factories used to be. Whoever controls data controls the future. Companies like Google and Facebook are collecting massive amounts of data about us, and Harari suggests they aren't just using it to show us ads. They're building the power to understand us deeply and even make decisions for us. He uses the example of asking Google to choose the best car for you, based on everything it knows about your life and preferences. Harari worries that this data could be used to re-engineer life itself, creating new forms of life or enhancing existing ones. He believes that if a small group controls this power, it could lead to a world where people are biologically different, creating a new kind of class system. He draws a parallel to historical situations where one group took advantage of another, like when Europeans traded trinkets for land with Native Americans. He fears we are unknowingly giving away our most valuable asset, our personal data, for things like free email and funny videos. The author acknowledges the difficulty of solving this problem. He suggests that simply giving the government control of data could lead to a controlling digital dictatorship. Letting individuals own their data is also tricky, because data is hard to control. It can be copied and shared easily. Harari believes we need to find a new way to regulate data ownership, and quickly, because the future of our society depends on it. He suggests that perhaps the very people creating these technologies could also help find solutions. He wonders if companies like Facebook could bring people together to collectively own and manage data for the benefit of everyone. Ultimately, Harari poses a challenging question. Are we all moving towards the same future, or are different groups of people heading down completely different paths? He suggests that in some places, people should focus on learning skills for a high-tech future, while in others, they might need to prepare for a more difficult reality. He concludes by questioning whether the idea of we, humankind as a whole, even exists anymore, given the potential for such dramatic divisions. Chapter 5: Community. Yuval Noah Harari explores Facebook's attempt to rebuild communities in a world where people feel increasingly disconnected. He points out that after the 2016 election, Facebook realized it might be contributing to the problem and tried to use technology to fix it. Mark Zuckerberg believed that a decline in community membership was causing many of the world's problems, and he wanted Facebook to help people find belonging again. However, the Cambridge Analytica scandal quickly showed that Facebook wasn't protecting people's information, making its promises seem empty. Harari argues that even with better security, simply creating online groups isn't enough. Humans have always needed close, personal communities, small groups, where people truly know each other. For a very long time, people lived in bands of just a few dozen individuals, and most people can only maintain around 150 meaningful relationships. Trying to replace these real connections with large, imagined communities like nations or political parties doesn't work, because they lack the warmth and intimacy of true friendship. This lack of connection, Harari suggests, is a root cause of many of today's problems. The author explains that Facebook's vision is interesting because of its size, resources, and belief in technology. It's the first time someone has tried to use artificial intelligence to intentionally build a global community. But Harari cautions that Facebook's business model, making money by grabbing attention and selling it to advertisers, might make it impossible to truly build a community. It's hard to focus on bringing people together when your goal is to keep them scrolling and clicking on ads. Harari emphasizes a crucial lesson for the 21st century. Online connections are not the same as real-life ones. While Facebook can help people connect, it can't replace the feeling of having someone bring you soup when you're sick. He notes that technology has distanced us from our bodies and senses, making us more focused on what's happening online than what's happening around us. We're more likely to text a cousin in another country than talk to the person sitting next to us. The author suggests that we need tools to help us connect with our own experiences, not just share them online. Instead of immediately taking a picture of something exciting, we should take the time to actually feel it. People who are disconnected from their bodies and surroundings are more likely to feel lost and alone. Harari believes that losing touch with our physical selves is more damaging than losing religious or national identity. Harari points out that Facebook's success will depend on its ability to bridge the gap between online and offline. A community needs to exist in the real world to truly thrive. He also challenges Facebook to consider its tax policies, arguing that if it truly values community, it should contribute to the services that support it, like roads and hospitals. He questions whether a corporation can truly lead a social revolution, as revolutions often require sacrifices that companies aren't willing to make. Ultimately, Harari is skeptical but hopeful. He believes Facebook needs to prioritize social good over profits and be willing to change its entire approach. He warns that future technologies, like augmented reality and brain-computer interfaces, could further blur the lines between the online and offline worlds, potentially giving tech companies even more control over our lives. The biggest lesson, according to Harari, is that we must remember that humans have bodies, and that real connection requires more than just a screen and an internet connection. Chapter 6: Civilization. Yuval Noah Harari challenges the popular idea that the world is splitting into clashing civilizations, like the West versus the Muslim world. He argues that instead, there's really just one global civilization today, even though it seems like there's a lot of conflict. Many people believe events like the Syrian war or Brexit show these civilizations are at odds, but Harari suggests these are struggles within that single civilization, not between separate ones. He points out that even groups like ISIS aren't rooted in ancient traditions, but are actually influenced by modern ideas and thinkers. Harari explains that the idea of civilizations clashing like animal species fighting for survival is wrong. Animals are different because of their genes, but humans change their societies and beliefs much more easily. He uses Germany as an example, showing how it has gone through many different forms of government in a short period of time. This shows that human groups aren't stuck with one unchanging identity. He also questions the idea of a fixed European identity, pointing out that throughout history, Europe has had many different values and practices, not just democracy and human rights. The author emphasizes that civilizations are defined by change, not by staying the same. He uses the example of Jewish traditions regarding women, showing how what seems like ancient rules have actually changed over time. Similarly, he argues that even religions like Islam are constantly being reinterpreted and aren't fixed in stone. He notes that ISIS isn't truly reverting to pure Islam, but creating a new version of it. Harari then shifts to a broader point about how human groups have become more connected over time. He explains that tribes have merged into larger groups, like the creation of Germany and France from smaller regions. He predicts this trend will continue, with nations potentially merging into larger entities like a unified Europe. This merging happens in two ways: by creating connections between groups and by making practices more similar across groups. Even war, surprisingly, can create connections between enemies. To illustrate this global unity, Harari uses the example of the Olympics. He points out that despite political tensions, countries all follow the same rules and participate in the same way. The anthems and flags, while representing different nations, are all very similar in style. He contrasts this with what the medieval Olympics would have been like, where it would have been nearly impossible to agree on rules or even who should compete, given the huge differences in political and cultural systems. Harari argues that today, almost everyone accepts the same basic economic and scientific ideas. Even groups that oppose the West, like North Korea, understand and use the same principles of physics and economics. He concludes that the big challenges of the 21st century, like climate change and artificial intelligence, will require global cooperation, not clashes between civilizations. He suggests that conflict will happen within this global civilization, as people debate how to solve these problems, but it won't be a battle between fundamentally different worlds. He ultimately suggests that focusing on shared challenges and internal debates is a more accurate way to understand the world today than thinking about a clash of civilizations. Chapter 7: Nationalism. Yuval Noah Harari begins by questioning why people turn to nationalism when the world faces problems that affect everyone. He explains that loyalty to a nation isn't natural. Humans historically lived in small groups. Building national loyalty took a lot of work, happening only when groups needed to cooperate for big projects, like controlling rivers in ancient Egypt. These projects required more people and resources than a single tribe could manage. Harari points out that while nationalism can be helpful, it becomes dangerous when it turns into extreme pride and a belief that one's nation is better than others. He notes that nationalism used to be criticized for causing wars, but it also brought benefits like healthcare and education. However, the invention of nuclear weapons changed everything. The threat of total destruction forced countries to work together, creating a sense of global community. He recalls the Daisy ad from the 1964 U.S. presidential campaign, which powerfully illustrated the choice between cooperation and annihilation. The author argues that after the Cold War, globalization seemed like the future, but nationalism has resurfaced. People feel lost in a globalized world and seek comfort in their national identity, especially when facing economic uncertainty. Harari then focuses on three major challenges for the 21st century: nuclear war, ecological collapse, and technological disruption. He stresses that none of these can be solved by individual nations alone. Regarding nuclear war, Harari highlights that while avoiding nuclear conflict was a major achievement of the 20th century, a new arms race is underway. He uses the example of Brexit, arguing that the benefits of European cooperation for peace were overlooked. He emphasizes that in a world with nuclear weapons, preventing nuclear war must be prioritized above national interests. Turning to ecological collapse, Harari explains how humans are damaging the planet through pollution and resource depletion. He uses the example of phosphorus fertilizer, showing how actions in one place can have negative consequences elsewhere. He argues that climate change requires global solutions, as one country's actions affect everyone. Even powerful nations aren't immune, and nationalist approaches won't work. He points out that some countries might even benefit from climate change, creating further divisions. Harari then discusses the rapid pace of technological change, particularly in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. He argues that these technologies pose risks that transcend national borders. If one country pursues dangerous technologies, others will feel compelled to do the same. Ethical guidelines are needed, but nationalism hinders this because it focuses on short-term national gains rather than long-term global well-being. Harari concludes that the world needs to move beyond nationalism and embrace a global perspective. He suggests learning from the European Union, which has fostered cooperation while still respecting national identities. He believes that humans need to add loyalty to the planet, and humankind to their existing loyalties to family, community, and nation. He compares the situation to ancient tribes needing to cooperate to manage a river, arguing that today, we need global cooperation to manage global challenges. He suggests that globalizing politics, meaning prioritizing global issues within national political systems, is the key to survival. Chapter 8: Religion. Yuval Noah Harari begins by questioning if old religious ideas can help us solve today's big problems, like artificial intelligence and climate change. He acknowledges that while many people still follow religions, and they powerfully shape the world, they aren't very helpful when it comes to actually fixing things. Harari divides problems into three types: technical, policy, and identity. He argues that religions have largely lost their usefulness in the first two, but are incredibly important and often problematic when it comes to the third. Harari explains that in the past, religions did help with practical things like farming and healing. Priests would predict when to plant crops or try to cure illnesses. But science has taken over those roles. Now, we rely on experts like biologists and doctors, and even very religious people will go to a hospital when they're sick. This shift means our understanding of religion itself has changed. It's no longer about everyday solutions. Harari points out that religions weren't actually very good at these practical tasks anyway. Their strength was always in explaining why things happened, not how to make them happen. Science admits when it's wrong and tries again, while religions tend to offer excuses. When it comes to policy, things like economics and government, Harari argues that religions don't offer unique solutions. He uses Iran as an example. While religious leaders have influence, they still rely on modern economic theories developed by people like Karl Marx. They might use religious language to explain their decisions, but the actual ideas come from science and economics. He suggests that religions simply put a new coat of paint on existing systems. There's no such thing as Christian economics or Muslim economics. because religions can justify almost any economic policy. However, Harari stresses that religions are incredibly powerful when it comes to shaping identity, deciding who we are and who they are. He explains that people need to cooperate in large numbers, and shared stories, even fictional ones, are essential for building that cooperation. Religions provide those stories. He uses Japan as a compelling example. After being forced to modernize, Japan intentionally used Shinto, its native religion, to create a strong national identity and inspire fierce loyalty, even to the point of kamikaze pilots in World War II. Harari notes that many countries today do something similar, using religion to strengthen national feeling. He argues that this is a problem because the world's biggest challenges, like climate change and nuclear war, require global cooperation, not national loyalty. Religions, he contends, often reinforce those national divisions. While religions may preach universal values, they are often used to support nationalism. He concludes that religions are more of a hindrance than a help when it comes to solving global problems, acting as a tool for nationalism rather than a path to unity. Chapter 9: Immigration. Yuval Noah Harari begins by observing that while the world feels more connected than ever, encountering people with different ways of life can sometimes be unsettling. He points out that differences today seem bigger because we interact with more people from different backgrounds, unlike in the past when people rarely met those very different from themselves. This increased interaction, especially with immigration, puts a strain on how societies define themselves. He uses Europe as a prime example, noting the European Union's struggle to balance its ideals of openness with the challenges of integrating newcomers. Harari proposes thinking about immigration as a simple agreement with three parts. First, a country lets people in. Second, those people adopt the main values of their new home. Third, if they do, they become full members of society. However, he explains that disagreements arise over what each of these parts actually means, leading to confusion. He identifies four main areas of debate surrounding immigration and suggests looking at each one separately to understand the arguments better. The first debate centers on whether countries have to accept immigrants. Some believe there's a moral duty to help people seeking better lives, while others argue that countries have the right to choose who enters. Harari notes the tension between wanting to benefit from immigrant skills and labor, while also resisting full integration. He highlights that even restricting immigration completely is difficult, leading some to advocate for regulated immigration over illegal activity. The second debate focuses on how much immigrants should change to fit in. Should they abandon all their traditions? Harari explains that Europe is already diverse, and forcing conformity could be counterproductive. However, others worry that allowing too many people with different values could threaten the core principles of European society. He suggests that the debate hinges on whether immigrants are truly intolerant and on what exactly defines a uniquely European identity. The third debate concerns how long it takes for immigrants to become full citizens. Some want quick acceptance, while others believe a longer period of adjustment is needed. Harari uses the analogy of a tree planted in new soil. It takes time to truly take root. He points out the difference between how an individual feels about their new home versus how long it takes a society to fully accept them. Finally, Harari addresses whether the immigration deal is actually working. Are immigrants making an effort to integrate, and are host countries treating them fairly? He notes that both sides often focus on failures rather than successes, making it hard to assess the situation objectively. Harari then introduces a crucial shift in thinking, from racism to culturism. He explains that while old-fashioned racism based on biology is losing ground, a new form of prejudice based on culture is emerging. He clarifies that unlike racism, which lacks scientific basis, culturism can sometimes have a valid point. Different cultures do have different values and ways of life. However, he cautions against using cultural differences to justify prejudice or discrimination. Harari illustrates this with a fictional example of two countries, Warmland and Koldia, with contrasting approaches to conflict. He shows how cultural differences can affect workplace dynamics and opportunities, and how judging individuals based on cultural stereotypes can be unfair. He emphasizes that while culture is important, it shouldn't overshadow individual qualities. He points out that culturist arguments can be reasonable in specific situations, but often fall into traps like assuming one culture is objectively superior or applying broad generalizations to individuals. He uses the example of President Trump's comments about certain countries, noting that they were framed in cultural terms rather than biological ones. Harari concludes by stressing the need for careful consideration and democratic debate. He warns against letting fear, particularly fear of terrorism, derail the principles of freedom and tolerance. He suggests that if Europe and the world can't find a way to navigate these challenges, it doesn't bode well for addressing the larger problems facing humanity. Chapter 10, Terrorism. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that terrorism, while scary, actually causes far fewer deaths than everyday things like car accidents or diseases like diabetes. He points out that terrorists rely on creating fear, not necessarily causing huge amounts of damage. They are often weak groups trying to change things when they don't have strong armies. Harari illustrates this with the example of a fly buzzing in a bull's ear to make it destroy a china shop. The terrorists provoke a strong reaction from powerful countries. Harari stresses a key lesson. Overreacting to terrorism is often more dangerous than the terrorism itself. He uses historical examples, like the massive casualties of World War I's Battle of the Somme, to show that violence doesn't always lead to political change. He contrasts this with the relatively small scale of most terrorist attacks, even 9/11, compared to major wars. The author explains that terrorists want governments to make mistakes by responding too strongly, creating more chaos. The author explains that states often fall into the trap of playing the terrorists' game. Modern governments feel they must protect citizens from all violence, and a single terrorist act can feel like a huge failure. Harari uses the example of how we remember 9/11, focusing on the dramatic collapse of the Twin Towers rather than the attack on the Pentagon, which was strategically more important. This shows how terrorism is about creating a spectacle, and governments often respond with their own spectacles of security. Harari argues that a smart response to terrorism isn't about big displays of force, but about quiet, effective intelligence work to disrupt terrorist networks. He suggests the media also plays a role, often exaggerating the threat of terrorism to sell more newspapers. He emphasizes that we, as individuals, need to control our own fears and not let terrorists control our imaginations. The author then considers the possibility of terrorists getting weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear bombs. He argues that this would be a completely different situation, a much more serious threat. However, he cautions against letting the fear of this possibility lead to overreactions to current, smaller-scale terrorism. He points out that focusing too much on one threat can mean ignoring other important problems, like climate change or global poverty. Harari uses the example of the 1990s, when people worried about Russia collapsing or Germany becoming too powerful, but those fears didn't come true. Harari concludes by saying that the success of terrorism depends on us. If we stay calm and think clearly, terrorism will fail. If we give in to fear and overreact, terrorism will succeed. He suggests that the world of today, with its relative peace, might seem unbelievable to people living in a future filled with weapons of mass destruction, highlighting the importance of perspective and not letting fear dictate our actions. Chapter 11, War. Yuval Noah Harari begins by pointing out something amazing. The world is currently more peaceful than ever before in history. While ancient societies saw violence cause a large percentage of deaths, today that number is much lower. However, he notes a worrying trend, increasing tension and military spending since 2008, leading some to fear another world war. Harari argues that while current global issues are concerning, the world today is different from 1914, the last time a major war broke out. Back then, war seemed like a good idea to powerful people because it often led to wealth and power. Now, successful large-scale wars are rare. Throughout history, empires were built through conquering others, but this doesn't seem to work as well anymore. He uses examples like Britain's easy takeover of Egypt in the 1800s, contrasting it with the difficulties Western countries face occupying places today. Even the United States gained land through war, like conquering parts of the Southwest from Mexico, but such gains are less valuable now. The author explains that in the past, leaders knew what a successful war looked like. Today, they aren't so sure. The US won the Cold War without a major battle, and its later wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were costly failures. China has grown powerful through trade, not fighting. Even in the Middle East, countries like Iran and Israel have found it's often better to avoid direct, large-scale wars. They've learned that staying out of conflicts can be a smart move. Harari then focuses on Russia's actions. While Russia successfully took Crimea in 2014, this was due to unique circumstances, little resistance, and a lack of intervention from other countries. When Russia tried to repeat this success in other parts of Ukraine, it faced strong opposition. He suggests Russia's actions are more about defending itself than starting a new war, reacting to what it sees as Western expansion after the Cold War. He points out Russia is much smaller economically than the US and Europe, and lacks the technological advantages needed to win a major conflict. The core lesson Harari presents is that winning wars has become incredibly difficult in the 21st century. In the past, conquering lands meant gaining valuable resources like wheat fields and gold mines. Now, the most important resources are knowledge and technology, which can't be taken by force. Nuclear weapons and cyber warfare also make war too dangerous, as any major conflict could quickly escalate and cause massive destruction. It's no longer possible to win a war and come out ahead. Harari emphasizes that even if war isn't profitable, human stupidity could still lead to conflict. He uses the example of World War II, where the Axis powers made a disastrous decision to go to war despite likely knowing it wouldn't benefit them. He argues that people often overestimate their own rationality and underestimate the complexity of the world, leading to bad choices. He suggests that a little humility, recognizing that no nation or culture is superior, could help prevent future conflicts. He concludes that while war isn't inevitable, it's not impossible either, and we must be aware of the dangers of human error. Chapter 12, Humility. Yuval Noah Harari tackles a big idea in this chapter. Most people believe their group is the most important in the world, and that's simply not true. He points out how many cultures, Greeks, Chinese, Hindus, Muslims, and many others, all think their history is the real history, and everyone else came later. Harari playfully admits his own people, the Jews, are no different, often claiming credit for inventions and ideas. This tendency to see ourselves as the center of everything, he argues, is a major source of conflict and misunderstanding. A key lesson for the 21st century is recognizing this bias within ourselves and others. Harari illustrates this point with a personal story about writing his book *Sapiens* and the reaction from Israeli readers who questioned why Judaism wasn't given more attention. He explains that while Judaism has a rich history, its overall impact on the grand scheme of human history is relatively small compared to other global forces. He uses the analogy of Freud's mother essential to Freud's existence, but not a central figure in Western history herself. This highlights the importance of perspective. Just because something is important to us doesn't mean it's important to everyone. The author contends that the belief in one true God, while not inherently bad, has often led to intolerance. He contrasts this with polytheistic religions, where different gods were generally accepted, and explains how monotheism often fueled conflict as people believed their God demanded exclusive worship. This is a crucial lesson for today's world, where religious differences often cause tension. Harari suggests that recognizing the dangers of us versus them thinking is vital for peaceful coexistence. Harari then shifts focus to the role of Jewish people in modern science. He acknowledges their disproportionate contribution to scientific advancements, but emphasizes this occurred after embracing secularism and joining the wider scientific community. He clarifies that Jewish tradition itself didn't directly inspire these breakthroughs. This demonstrates that progress often happens when people move beyond rigid beliefs and embrace new ideas. Ultimately, Harari argues that humility is essential. He points out that many religions preach humility, but simultaneously believe they hold the ultimate truth. He uses the example of the belief that the universe exists solely for the purpose of Jewish scripture study as an extreme example of this contradiction. He encourages readers to question their own group's narratives and recognize the value of other cultures and perspectives. The author concludes by suggesting that a humble approach, even towards our beliefs about God, is crucial for a more peaceful and understanding future. Chapter 13, God. Yuval Noah Harari explores the idea of God and what it means for how we live today. He points out that people often think of God in two very different ways: as a big mystery about the universe, or as a rule maker who tells us exactly how to behave. Harari argues that confusing these two ideas can be really problematic. People often start by talking about the universe's mysteries, then quickly jump to using that to justify strict rules about things like clothes or relationships. This doesn't make sense, he explains, because the vastness of the universe doesn't really care about what we wear. Harari believes that holy books are often used to bridge this gap, claiming they come from the cosmic mystery, but are mostly filled with very specific rules created by humans. He suggests these rules were helpful for building societies in the past, but aren't fundamentally different from laws made by governments today. He questions why we need a supernatural explanation for morality when we can understand it through empathy and a desire to reduce suffering. The author highlights that morality isn't about following divine commands, but about understanding how our actions affect others. He uses the example of the early gay rights movement, where religious leaders chose compassion over strict biblical interpretations, showing that morality can exist independently of religious belief. Harari explains that all social animals, even chimpanzees, have ethical codes, and societies function well even without a shared belief in God. Denmark and the Czech Republic, for example, aren't more chaotic than religious countries like Iran or Pakistan. Harari emphasizes that negative emotions like anger and greed actually harm us first, before they harm others. He suggests that understanding this is a natural reason to be moral. It's in our own self-interest to avoid causing suffering. He acknowledges that religion can inspire compassion, but it can also justify hatred and violence. Ultimately, Harari believes we don't need God to be moral. Secular values, like empathy and a desire for a peaceful society, are enough. He concludes by suggesting that if we want a better world, we should stop using God to justify our own agendas. He encourages people to use different words when thinking about the mysteries of the universe, to avoid mixing it up with the often harmful rules created by people. Harari proposes that a society built on secularism, focused on reducing suffering and promoting well-being, is perfectly possible and doesn't require a belief in a higher power. Chapter 14, Secularism. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that many people think of secularism as simply not believing in religion. However, he argues that it's much more than that. It's a positive way of looking at the world built on important values like truth, fairness, and freedom. These values aren't new. They're found in many different cultures and religions around the world. The key difference is that secularism doesn't claim to have all the answers, unlike some religions that believe they alone hold the truth. Harari points out that secularism allows people to have multiple identities. You can still practice a religion like Islam or Christianity and also be a good citizen in a secular society, as long as you follow a shared ethical code. This code emphasizes things like honesty, kindness, and respecting others. He uses France as an example, showing that even countries striving to be secular sometimes fall short of their ideals, just like any society can struggle to live up to its best principles. The author stresses that the most important part of secularism is a commitment to truth, based on evidence and observation, not just faith. Believing something strongly doesn't make it true. Secularism also avoids putting any one group, person, or book in charge of all the answers. Instead, it looks for truth everywhere, in science, history, and different cultures. This is why modern science has been so successful in understanding the world around us. Harari explains that secular ethics focuses on reducing suffering, not just following rules. For example, secular people don't kill because it causes pain, not just because a religious text forbids it. Harari acknowledges that secular ethics can be tricky. When choices involve hurting some people to help others, there aren't always easy answers. He uses examples like taxes, war, and immigration to illustrate these dilemmas. When faced with these situations, secular people try to weigh everyone's feelings and find a solution that causes the least harm. He tackles sensitive topics like sexuality, explaining that secularism judges actions based on whether they cause harm. He uses the example of marriage, arguing that a loving relationship between two consenting adults doesn't hurt anyone, while a relationship with an animal lacks the emotional depth needed for well-being. He also explains why incest is harmful, citing psychological studies. The author warns that secularism can sometimes become too rigid, turning into its own kind of dogma. He uses the example of Stalinism, which started as a secular movement but became a harsh and controlling ideology. He also points out that even capitalism and liberal democracy can fall into dogmatic thinking. Harari emphasizes that believing in human rights is a valuable dogma, but it's still a belief system and shouldn't prevent us from questioning and adapting to new challenges, especially with advancements in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. Harari concludes by urging readers to acknowledge the shadow side of any belief system, including secularism. Every ideology has the potential for misuse, and it's important to be aware of this. He argues that secularism's strength lies in its willingness to admit mistakes and learn from them. He suggests trusting those who acknowledge their ignorance over those who claim to have all the answers, especially when making important decisions about the future. He believes that a humble and questioning approach is more likely to lead to positive change than rigid certainty. He encourages self-reflection, asking what mistakes a particular worldview has made in the past as a measure of its trustworthiness. Chapter 15, Ignorance. Yuval Noah Harari argues that one of the biggest challenges of our time is realizing just how little we actually know. He points out that for a long time, people believed individuals were smart and could figure things out on their own. But this idea doesn't quite fit with reality. He explains that our brains often take shortcuts and rely on feelings instead of careful thinking, especially when dealing with complicated stuff like technology or global issues. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's helped us build societies, but it can lead to problems. Harari emphasizes that we don't think as individuals, but as groups. Think about building something huge like a skyscraper or a computer. No one person knows everything needed to make it happen. We depend on others' knowledge, and we often act as if that knowledge is our own. He calls this the knowledge illusion. We feel confident about understanding things, but often we don't have a deep understanding of how they work, like most people not being able to explain a zipper in detail. The author warns that this illusion becomes dangerous in a world that's getting more and more complex. People are quick to form strong opinions on things like climate change or international conflicts, even if they can't locate those places on a map. Harari believes simply giving people more facts won't fix this. He explains that people tend to stick with beliefs that their friends and online feeds confirm, creating echo chambers. Trying to change someone's mind with facts can even backfire, as people don't like feeling wrong. Harari illustrates this with an example of political divides, noting how conservatives and progressives often have very different views on environmental issues, not necessarily based on logic, but on what their political group believes. Even scientists, who value facts, can fall into this trap of believing facts alone will change minds. He uses a humorous example from Monty Python to show how easily people can agree with something just because everyone else is, even if it doesn't make sense. The core lesson, according to Harari, is that power makes it even harder to see things clearly. Leaders are busy and surrounded by people who want something from them, making it difficult to get honest information. He shares his own experience of a dinner with a prime minister, where everyone was trying to impress him instead of having a real conversation. To find truth, leaders need to step away from the center of power and spend time exploring new ideas, even if they seem silly at first. Harari concludes that as the world becomes more complicated, we will all know less and less. He echoes the ancient philosopher Socrates, suggesting that the most important thing we can do is admit we don't know. This leads to a bigger question. If we can't understand the world, how can we know what's right and wrong? This is a challenge Harari leaves the reader to ponder. Chapter 16, Justice. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that our sense of what's fair, or justice, comes from a very old time, when people lived in small groups as hunters and gatherers. Back then, questions of fairness were simple. If one person hunted a deer and another found mushrooms, how should they share? But Harari argues that, while the basic questions haven't changed, the size of the problems we face has grown enormously, and our brains haven't caught up. We're trying to use ancient instincts to solve modern, global issues like war, inequality, and climate change. The problem isn't that we lack good values, Harari clarifies. Most people agree on what's right and wrong. The trouble is applying those values to a world with billions of people and incredibly complicated connections. It was easy to see if someone was being treated unfairly when you lived with them and saw exactly what happened. Now, it's hard to know how our actions affect people on the other side of the world. For example, buying a cheap shirt might seem harmless, but it could be made by someone working in unfair conditions. Harari points out that our ancestors knew where everything came from. They gathered their own food and made their own tools. Today, we're incredibly reliant on a huge network of systems we don't understand. We don't know where our food comes from, who made our clothes, or what our money is being used for. This makes it hard to act morally because we can't see the full consequences of our choices. He uses the example of investing in a company that pollutes a river, even if the investor doesn't know about the pollution. Is the investor guilty of wrongdoing? The author explains that traditional ideas about stealing, physically taking something, don't quite fit the modern world. He asks if we are stealing rivers when companies damage the environment for profit, and if we are complicit when we benefit from those profits without knowing how they were made. Harari suggests that in a world this complex, simply trying to do the right thing isn't enough. We have a responsibility to know what's going on. He reminds us that terrible events in history often happened not because of evil intentions, but because people were ignorant or didn't care enough to find out the truth. Harari warns that people often deal with these overwhelming problems in unhelpful ways. One way is to simplify things too much, like pretending a complicated war is just a fight between good and evil. Another is to focus on emotional stories instead of looking at facts. People also create conspiracy theories to explain things that are too complex to understand, or they blindly follow ideologies or leaders. These approaches avoid the hard work of truly understanding the world. He acknowledges that it's almost impossible for one person to understand all the connections and problems in the world. He uses the example of an African American man who understands the challenges of being Black in America, but can't fully understand the experiences of a Chinese lesbian woman. Everyone has a limited perspective. Harari believes that simply trusting one group's viewpoint isn't enough to solve global problems. Harari concludes by suggesting that we've reached a point where most of us can't truly grasp the moral issues of our time. He questions whether we should give up on trying to find justice, or if there's a way to navigate this complexity. He doesn't offer easy answers, but emphasizes the importance of recognizing our limitations and striving for greater understanding, even if it's a difficult and frustrating process. Chapter 17, Post-Truth. Yuval Noah Harari argues that the idea of a post-truth era isn't new at all. Throughout history, humans have relied on stories and beliefs, even untrue ones, to work together. He points to Russia's denial of invading Crimea as a recent example, but quickly shows that similar things have happened for centuries. From Japan creating a fake country in the 1930s to ancient myths and religious beliefs, humans have always mixed fiction and reality. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how we've built societies and cooperated on a large scale. Harari explains that believing in shared stories is what allows us to trust each other and follow the same rules. He uses the example of money. We all agree it has value, even though it's just paper or numbers on a screen. This shared belief is a fiction that makes the world work. However, this reliance on fiction also makes us vulnerable to manipulation. He highlights how easily propaganda can be used to justify actions, referencing examples from Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. These regimes skillfully used lies and rewritten histories to control their people. For the 21st century, Harari stresses that recognizing this human tendency towards believing fictions is crucial. He cautions against thinking that truth will automatically win out. Instead, he suggests we need to be more critical of the information we consume. He offers two main pieces of advice. Pay for reliable news sources, as free information often comes at the cost of being influenced, and consult scientific literature when dealing with important issues. He believes that good journalism and scientific research are our best tools for navigating a world filled with misinformation. Harari also emphasizes the importance of scientists engaging with the public. He suggests that communicating complex ideas through popular science books and even science fiction can be more effective than publishing research papers that few people read. He believes science fiction, in particular, shapes how people understand new technologies and challenges like climate change. Ultimately, Harari doesn't believe humans will ever fully escape the realm of fiction. He argues that a complete reliance on truth would actually hinder our ability to cooperate and build societies. Instead, he encourages a balance, a willingness to question, to verify, and to understand the power of stories, both true and false, in shaping our world. He concludes that recognizing our species' inherent, post-truth, nature is the first step towards navigating the complexities of the modern age. Chapter 18, Science Fiction. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that humans are successful because we work together, and we work together because we believe in shared stories, what he calls fictions. These stories, like religions or beliefs about money, aren't necessarily true, but they allow large groups of people to cooperate. He points out that art, like movies and TV, now plays a huge role in shaping these stories, especially when it comes to understanding new technologies. This means science fiction has a big responsibility to get things right, or it could lead people to worry about the wrong things. Harari argues that much of today's science fiction focuses too much on robots becoming superintelligent and turning against us. He believes a more likely danger is a small group of people gaining enormous power through technology, leaving the rest of society behind. He suggests looking to the ideas of Karl Marx, not just filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, to understand the potential problems with artificial intelligence. He uses the movie Ex Machina as an example, suggesting it's less about fearing robots and more about anxieties surrounding powerful women. The author then explores how science fiction often portrays people escaping from controlled environments, like The Matrix or The Truman Show. However, Harari points out that these stories usually assume there's a real self and a real world to escape to. He challenges this idea, suggesting that even if we broke free from these artificial worlds, we'd likely find ourselves in another, equally constructed reality. He uses the examples of Neo from The Matrix and Truman from The Truman Show to illustrate this point. Their freedom doesn't lead to drastically different lives. Harari believes we are already inside a box. our brains and society, and escaping one box just means entering another. Harari then turns to Disney's Inside Out as a surprisingly insightful example. He notes that the movie shows us that we don't have a single, authentic self, but are instead a collection of different emotions and mechanisms working together. Disney, he observes, is essentially telling us that free will might be an illusion. This idea connects to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which Harari considers the most prophetic science fiction book of the 20th century. Huxley imagined a future where people are happy and comfortable, but at the cost of freedom, meaning, and even unhappiness. Harari explains that Huxley's vision is more frightening than George Orwell's 1984 because control is achieved through pleasure, not fear. People willingly give up their freedom for happiness. The author highlights a conversation in the book where characters debate the value of struggle, pain, and even sin, arguing that a life without these things isn't truly living. Ultimately, Harari suggests that the biggest lesson from these stories is that the idea of a completely free and authentic self might be a myth, and that understanding this could be crucial for navigating the future. Chapter 19, Education. Yuval Noah Harari begins by pointing out that the world is changing faster than ever before, and the future is really uncertain. A baby born today will live to see a world drastically different from our own, and we don't really know what skills they'll need to succeed. Unlike the past, where life was predictable, we can't assume today's lessons will be useful tomorrow. Harari explains that in the past, people could confidently teach their children skills they knew would still be needed later on. But now, with technology changing so quickly, many things we learn in school might be useless in the future. He uses the example of learning a specific computer language, like C++. It might be replaced by artificial intelligence before a student even graduates. The author argues that schools currently focus too much on giving students facts, when what they really need is the ability to understand information. In the past, information was hard to find, so memorizing it was important. Now we have too much information, and it's often wrong or confusing. Harari notes that it's easy to get lost in endless online content, from news to cat videos, and struggle to figure out what's true. Harari believes schools should focus on teaching students how to think, not what to think. He suggests focusing on skills like critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity skills that will be useful no matter what the future holds. He emphasizes the importance of being able to adapt to change and keep learning throughout life. He contrasts the past with the future, explaining that life used to be divided into learning and then working. But in the future, life will be a constant process of learning and reinventing yourself. Jobs will change quickly, and even our identities might become fluid. Harari uses a hypothetical example of someone changing their gender and profession multiple times throughout their life, highlighting the need for flexibility. Harari warns that technology isn't always helpful. While it can be a powerful tool, it can also control us if we're not careful. He compares it to agriculture, which benefited a few while enslaving many. He suggests that companies and governments are already trying to hack our brains and emotions through data and algorithms. The author stresses the importance of self-awareness. He argues that understanding ourselves is more important than ever, because others are trying to understand and manipulate us. He encourages readers to question everything, including what adults and technology tell them. Harari concludes by urging people to learn about themselves before algorithms do, and to let go of old beliefs to stay adaptable in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 20, Meaning. Yuval Noah Harari argues that people have always searched for meaning in life through stories, but these stories are ultimately human creations, not truths about the universe. He believes this is a crucial lesson for the 21st century, recognizing that our beliefs are constructed narratives, not inherent realities. He uses examples like the Hindu story of Dharma, Disney's The Lion King, and religious narratives to show how stories provide roles and purpose, but are not necessarily true. Harari points out that the scale of a story doesn't make it more valid. Whether a story focuses on a small nation or the entire cosmos, it remains a human invention. He illustrates this with the example of Jerusalem, showing how claims of its eternal significance are absurd when viewed against the vastness of time. He explains that people readily sacrifice for these stories, even when they are demonstrably untrue, because the stories provide identity and belonging. The author explains that stories gain power not through truth, but through rituals. Rituals, like religious ceremonies or nationalistic displays, make abstract ideas feel real and concrete. He uses the example of the Christian Mass and the Hindu horse sacrifice to demonstrate how rituals transform belief into tangible experience. Harari emphasizes that sacrifice strengthens belief, as people are less likely to question something they've suffered for. Harari notes that people rarely hold just one belief. Instead, they maintain a portfolio of stories, switching between them as needed. He warns against the danger of ideologies, like fascism, that demand absolute loyalty to a single story, suppressing all others. He uses the example of Nazi Germany to show how dangerous it is when a nation demands complete devotion, ignoring other values and identities. The author contends that modern society offers a supermarket of stories, allowing individuals to choose what resonates with them. However, Harari cautions that this freedom can be misleading. Liberalism, he argues, mistakenly believes that individuals create meaning, when in reality, our desires and beliefs are shaped by biological and cultural factors beyond our control. He uses the example of someone choosing a favorite flavor of ice cream to illustrate how our preferences aren't freely chosen, but are influenced by our biology and experiences. Harari draws on Buddhist philosophy to suggest that the search for meaning is itself the source of suffering. He explains that clinging to stories and identities creates dissatisfaction because everything is constantly changing. He uses the example of a Buddhist monk observing their breath to illustrate the practice of simply observing reality without imposing meaning on it. He cautions that even attempting to find meaning in no meaning can become another story to cling to. Ultimately, Harari urges readers to recognize the difference between fiction and reality. He suggests focusing on suffering as a test of truth, as suffering is a concrete experience that cannot be denied. He contrasts the real suffering of a victim of violence with the abstract suffering of a nation, highlighting that only the individual experience is truly real. He concludes that understanding this distinction is essential for navigating the complexities of the 21st century and reducing human misery. Chapter 21, Meditation. Yuval Noah Harari reflects on how he, a skeptic of many things, finds peace and clarity in his daily life, and shares this journey as a lesson for the modern world. He explains that after years of questioning stories and beliefs, he felt lost searching for truth. University studies helped him break down ideas, but didn't offer answers to life's big questions. He felt frustrated, stuck in endless thinking without real understanding. A friend suggested Vipassana meditation, a practice of focused attention, and Harari initially dismissed it as nonsense. However, after much encouragement, he tried a 10-day retreat. He discovered it wasn't about mystical theories, but a simple, practical exercise, paying attention to his breath. The core lesson was to just observe, without trying to control or judge, noticing when his mind wandered. This became a turning point, teaching him that the real mystery isn't what happens after death, but how we experience life before death. Harari realized that people often search for answers outside themselves, while ignoring the present moment. He found that the idea of a lasting self is an illusion. Our bodies, brains, and thoughts are constantly changing. He argues that understanding this constant change is key to understanding life itself. He learned that many beliefs about the soul or afterlife are simply stories we tell ourselves. Meditation revealed to Harari that he had far less control over his own mind than he thought. He wasn't the CEO of his life, but struggled to even stay focused on his breath for a few seconds. This humility was a powerful lesson. The practice expanded to observing all bodily sensations, heat, pain, pressure, and recognizing that our reactions aren't to events themselves, but to how those events feel in our bodies. Anger, for example, isn't about the cause, but about the physical sensations accompanying it. Harari emphasizes that suffering isn't an external condition, but a mental reaction to wanting things to be different than they are. By observing these patterns, we can begin to lessen our suffering. He now meditates for hours each day, finding it essential for his work and clarity of thought. He sees meditation not as an escape, but as a way to connect with reality. Harari draws a parallel between brain research and meditation, suggesting they are complementary approaches to understanding the mind. Science excels at studying the brain's physical structure, but struggles to explain subjective experience. Meditation offers a direct way to observe the mind, something science currently lacks the tools to do effectively. He uses the analogy of digging a tunnel through a mountain. It's more efficient to dig from both sides. He cautions that studying the mind through meditation requires discipline and effort. It's not a quick fix, and shortcuts like pills might miss the point. The goal isn't just focus, but a deep exploration of consciousness. Harari believes that understanding our minds is becoming increasingly important in a world dominated by technology and algorithms. As stories and beliefs become more easily manipulated, the ability to observe our own thoughts and feelings objectively is crucial. He urges readers to take this opportunity now, before algorithms define who we are for us. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.